All right. Welcome. This is a podcast from the Colorado Association of Charter School Authorizers, and I am Alex Medler, the ED of CACSA, who will be facilitating our discussion today. Today, we're going to talk about approaches to renewal during COVID. And in particular, I'd like to focus on a couple of our biggest and strongest authorizers, Denver Public Schools, who's represented here by Matt Meyer, and the Charter School Institute, represented by Ryan Marks. Both these authorizers use a strategy of shorter term renewals that are less than 5 years and that can have conditions attached that might lead to either extending them or to closing the school or other actions that are based on performance measures. This is a strategy that I frankly wish I had when I chaired the CSI board. We did it sometimes, but not very much. And I felt great when we affirmed a good school and gave them a new 5-year charter. It was really an affirming, easy thing to do as a leader of an authorizer. I felt pretty bad when we closed the school, but I also felt as a system leader that I was obliged to close a school that was failing its students and the public interest. But I must say I felt very in between and not great about schools that fell in between, where they were not bad enough to close, but you wanted to continue to track things. And I think I'm pleased to see DPS and CSI, as they evolve, consider this approach more and think about the benefits it brings and the nuance. So that's what I kind of want to talk about. Before we dive in, I'm going to ask our two guests to give you a little background on themselves and their authorizers portfolio. You want to go first, Ryan?
Sure, happy to. Like Alex said, my name is Ryan Marks. I'm the Director of Evaluation, Accountability, and School Improvement at the Colorado Charter School Institute, the statewide authorizer for charters here in Colorado. So our portfolio in this current school year, we have 42 charter schools all across the state. Our newest charter school just opened in the southwest part of the state, the Mountain Ute Kewagat Community Academy down there on the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation. Serves just a handful of students. Our largest school in the Denver metro area, Pinnacle Charter School, serves about 2,200, so a wide range across the state and in terms of sizes. This past renewal cycle, we had 8 schools up for renewal. And we have, as an authorizer, we have about 25, 26 staff working in our shop. But because we are sort of a one-stop shop, we've got both authorizing staff, we've also got grants management staff, we've got legal and compliance staff, student services staff, and professional learning staff. So that 26 is inclusive of all of the different roles we serve, including authorizer.
Great. And Matt, tell us about you and DPS for background.
Hi all, I'm Matt. I'm the Senior Manager of Accountability on the Portfolio Management Team. We are the District Authorizer within Denver Public Schools. We oversee 58 charter schools here that operate in our district. Quite a variety. We have schools up from about 1,000 students down to low 100s. We have schools serving along a variety of different models, from pathway and alternative campuses to larger secondary schools. Here in DPS, we serve about 85,000 students. We're the largest district in the state of Colorado and also the largest authorizer in Colorado. We have 6 staff members who directly work on charter authorizing, but something that I really appreciate about being in a district office is that we have lots of folks for whom some aspect of charter authorizing or oversight is a portion of their job, in addition to serving our district schools. A phrase we like to talk about in Denver is our family of schools, and that we have over 200 schools of all governments type, all working towards the common mission and vision here at DPS.
Great. Well, let's dive into this last round of renewals. I know with COVID, we've had pauses in testing, stopping the accountability system as sort of in its tracks, and that I know that you're both authorizers were pretty closely linked to the state accountability system and used it and leveraged it quite a bit, as well as your own performance frameworks. So let's start with the big picture and then get down to the more micro. But how did this renewal cycle go? And what did you have to change in your process to make it work? You want to go first, Matt?
Sure. Certainly the last 2 years have been challenging for everyone, students, families, staff, and they've also had an impact on our authorizing practices. We had 17 schools up for renewal in this last cycle. And, going back to March 2020, we made a pretty intentional decision early on with our charter authorizing work that it was important to continue doing charter renewals through the pandemic in the first year and again in the second year. really a lot of the guiding principle behind that was, if students are in schools, we need to be doing oversight to make sure they're being served well, while acknowledging the really extraordinary circumstances in which everyone's trying to operate. For us, we were also in the shift from using a district-specific performance framework to our state performance framework. So we already had some pretty major changes in our processes coming up. Though historically in our renewal process, we've relied pretty heavily on site visits and more qualitative data. And I think for us, the first big shift in the pandemic was leaning more into that qualitative and site visit work, whether that looked like doing virtual visits in 2020 or in-person visits in the most recent cycle, though ones that acknowledge the context in which we were operating. The second big shift we had to think about was how we think about performance. And in this current cycle, we made the decision to still anchor off of schools' performance ratings in 2019. We considered a lot of different options, but felt that it was probably the least bad option at this point to be able to have some nod to a school's historic performance. And since, we generally work off of a 5-year framework, felt like it was still appropriate to use that data that's at this year point, about 3 years old to ground those decisions. But then actually lean on the work that I'm sure Ryan will talk about from CSI, open the opportunity for schools to share additional local data to help understand outcomes-based performance that is available since then, that either on what state tests were available, but also on local measures.
And how about you at the high level, Ryan? How did things go, and what was the big stuff you had to change?
Yeah, so I think overall, I continue to feel very appreciative of the work that CSI and the staff have done, and all of the school leaders and boards have done, and the CSI board over the last 2 years. I think we've always operated under the principle that that Matt articulated. Students are in school. We need to continue to do our oversight work. And we need to continue to recognize and adjust according to the context in which we find ourselves. So trying to be really communicative with all stakeholders was really important in that first year in our 2020 cycle. We did a lot of outreach to school leaders and school boards to understand how they were feeling about accountability via renewal decision making, what data they would find important for us to consider, how they would respond to various strategies or proposals that we might put forward to adjust our processes. So we kind of kept working around, let's do the next right thing here, to steal a line from Frozen. My daughter is obsessed, but I think it's apropos, or it's appropriate here. And so we just, grounded in our values and tried to be very communicative with all of the different stakeholders. So I think because of that, it went well, right? It felt like we were very transparent. We worked with schools, we worked alongside schools, we worked with our board to make sure that all of our work was kind of values aligned and transparent and above board. We did make the decision in 2020 to ground in the prior year's state data and state rating, so the 18-19 rating, and then to sort of create a process for schools to go through, at that point, what we called our supplemental body of evidence review, if the renewal was going to be materially impacted by their performance in 1920. So really leveraging schools that had long histories of success, saying it's unlikely that you're going to have had a different outcome in 1920 that would have changed our mind. But since we prioritize trends over time, we wanted to recognize that there were schools where this most recent year of data was going to make a difference for them between, say, a 2-year contract and a 3-year contract or a 4-year contract. So we did create a process to look at local data to account for that. In our 2021 cycle, we continued to evolve and continued to communicate with schools and boards. We did a survey of our renewal schools from 2020, asked them how it went, what you liked, what you didn't like, to inform our responses, and again, communicated with the school leaders and boards in the 2021 cycle. And we created a similar process to look at additional data. However, in this case, we looked at additional data for all of our schools, brought in new information that wasn't previously considered. However, we still anchored on the prior performance if we had it for schools that had longer histories, and really elevated that over the new data. But for schools that we didn't have the ability to anchor on that historic data, tried to find alternative ways to elevate new measures, other measures. And we did include, because we did have data from 2020, we included, 2021, we did include that CMS data and the PSAT data as well in our review. Even though it was different, we included it as a part of our process. So I think overall it went well. Again, we did virtual visits in 2020. We went back to in-person visits here in 2021, kind of leveraging some of the good practices that came from the virtual visits and parent conversations, student conversations that we hadn't had previously, given that we're so spread out across the state. Tried to maintain some of those, but overall, yeah, I think it went well.
That's great. Well, let me ask. I come at authorizing previously as an appointed board member rather than the staff for when I had to make decisions. How was the alignment this year, and how did you feel as staff in terms of your ability to assess the quality? Were you comfortable that you understood the performance well enough, to feel good about the recommendations, and how did your boards feel about them? Matt, you want to go first?
In terms of the ability to assess quality, I mean, that's in terms of always seeking to be better. We're always wondering, like, how well did we do in understanding a school? And I think that was more at the front of our minds this year. I do think something that struck me in both of the pandemic renewal cycles we've had is that seeing that schools across the board are facing consistent challenges, but have different responses to those challenges, and often found ourselves in situations where a school would be pointing at very real impacts of the pandemic in terms of explaining what is an issue at the school or what is causing a certain performance. But the value of having across our large portfolio of doing 17 site visits, be able to say, like, yes, everyone is experiencing that challenge, but you are responding to it in a way that's different, or the output that's resulting is different. And I think because we were able to see that sort of variance, again, especially in those qualitative measures, felt strong that we were able to get a good sense of where a school was at. I think also, like, in terms of once our schools got to see the recommendations report, we generally had buy-in. We always allow for factual responses and things like that, like most good authorizers do, but found that we had buy-in even for schools who were getting more significant feedback. And so appreciate that in terms of our process. I feel like we were getting to assess quality. Ryan also spoke a lot in terms of, like, the work that was done before the cycle to reach out with their school leaders and stakeholders. And I think for that's probably one of the things that I'm most proud of in the last 2 years. Here in DPS, we have a representative body called the Collaborative Council that's elected representatives of the charter sector who engage with our authorizing staff on frameworks, accountability, on operations, and found that partnership to be really essential to agree to how we were going to apply our authorizing and accounting practices through the pandemic, and getting that buy-in ahead of time before it was about a particular school and a particular circumstance.
That's great. Congrats. Ryan, how about you? How'd you feel about it all, and how'd it go?
Yeah. I think in terms of, like, outcomes and alignment, I think we found the right balance at the end of the day. And that is a question that we've reflected on. We often strive for alignment with our board. We don't want perfect alignment, though. Like, we want there to be some room for disagreement between what the staff recommend and what the board recommend. And I think CSI is uniquely positioned to have those good substantive conversations around kind of the nuance between a 2+2 and a 3+2, for example, and which school may be eligible for which kind of performance contract. So we did have some disagreements there, and kind of the at the end of the day, I think staff felt like the decision that staff made and the decisions that the board made were both the right decisions, and that you could argue either way because the context is so tricky right now for schools, that we grappled with, is it a 2+2 or is it a 3+2? And then to have the board grapple with that same questions, I think means we're grappling with the same fundamental questions around what makes a good school, and what sort of decisions do we need to make as authorizers in response to the data and the information we have. So I think in that respect, it was good. I think we want our schools to always feel like we're giving them kind of grace where grace is due, and continually being fair and holding them to the same expectations as others. So we grappled with that as well. And I think we hit that, and like Matt said, we always release the reports to schools ahead of time, offer opportunities for feedback, offer opportunities for dialogue. I did have conversations with folks that, wanted to get more information on, when you said this word or this sentence, like, what did you mean by that? Like, what is informing that, kind of trying to read between the lines. And at the end of the day, those conversations were great because it surfaced some issues, it surfaced some challenges. There was mutual understanding of the challenge, and kind of my understanding of how they were addressing that moving forward grew because they were able to talk about like the things that they've identified and understood. So again, at the end of the day, it really is about collaboration. It is about transparency. Everyone's working towards having a great school for kids. And so if we keep that front of mind, I think, this was a win there. Yeah, I think those are my thoughts in terms of how it all panned out.
Yeah, let's roll up our sleeves and get nerdy here for a little bit. So at the core, Ryan, you're speaking directly to it. When you're talking about these shorter term renewals, the question is, well, what's the difference between a 2+2, 2+3, or 2+3 with an option to close? Really, are we overthinking it, overanalyzing it, or are these important distinctions? And how do you make those decisions? So maybe, Ryan, you could start with just a sense of, how does CSI structure it? And, what's the original thinking that goes into making one choice versus another in terms of short-term conditional renewals?
Yeah, so the broad idea is, that us as an authorizer only have a limited number of levers that we can pull, right? And term length, at renewal is one of those levers. And it's one of the opportunities for us to continue to have conversation or be in conversation with schools that may be struggling or that may need additional oversight or additional support to deliver on the outcomes that they've promised families. And so for us, it really is a way for us to both signal, what we think in terms of a quality school that has capacity to continue to serve its students well, and a school that may be working towards getting to quality outcomes for kids, may have a lot of the leading indicators or some of the infrastructure in place, but the outcomes aren't quite there. And so in that case, right, for a school like that, the performance contract sort of offers up some carrots, offers up some incentives. Like, it recognizes that they have potentially strong capacity in place, leading indicators of success, but the outcomes aren't quite there. And so that's where the 2+2 or the 3+2 come into play. And we say, like, we believe in you. And, we hope that you hit these performance expectations here in 2 years and get the automatic renewal and get the full 5-year contract, because we think you have those things in place. We just want to hedge a little bit and give ourselves the opportunity to come back and have another conversation if you don't hit those outcomes. And at that point, it's just another renewal. So we really see it as an opportunity to communicate clearly that we think you're on the right track, but that the outcomes aren't quite there, or aren't quite where we want them to be. So that's where those +2s come into place. With the shorter term contracts without the +2s, we had 2-year renewals here this past cycle. It's really about just kind of the underlying instability, and there may be more concerns than one concern, specifically academic outcomes, that require us to keep you closer. Because we don't want to have a performance contract where you've got like 18 different things that you have to meet, because there are different concerns and we've got milestones attached to each of those. So generally, the performance contracts are reserved for schools with one thing that they're working on. The shorter term contracts are for schools that have a few other things that we've got to work on.
Okay. And Matt, in DPS, what's the thinking you have that goes into, 2 versus 3 versus 2 to close, or 2+3 to stay open automatically? How do you think about it?
We've simplified our framework in the last 2 years. And we've had different approaches. We've always had some sort of matrix that guides our decision-making, while leaving room for professional judgment. But our current matrix, which you can find posted on our board docs, it's our board regulation AFR, really breaks schools down into 4 general categories. Things are going well, both on leading indicators and data, you get a 5-year renewal. A set of schools that, based on historical performance and leading indicators, we feel confident that they have a strong trajectory forward, but we want to have some built-in checkpoint. And for us, that checkpoint is almost always that they are rated green on the state performance framework. Then the third group of schools are schools that are only going to get a 2-year renewal. And really the rationale there is, regardless of what happens over that next 2-year term, there's been enough concern in the past. We want to have a comprehensive check-in that even theoretically that school were to get to green, we just need to see a full body of evidence to make sure that things are going well for all students. And then obviously the hard decision of a non-renewal or a closure. I think this year I appreciated having those more clear delineations and rationales. I think in the past, when we've gotten into like 2+1 versus 2+2, it implied a certainty around for future performance that the data didn't really support in terms of how we collected it. And especially for our, our board members and the public, liked having those more clear delineations. I would say for us, in terms of like what plays into that thinking, is a lot of like, we're making some sort of, not prediction, but we're making some sense of like, what is your future trajectory going to be? And we've tried to more integrate some of the state systems for that. So our application this year brought in major improvement strategies, which for anyone who's watching outside of Colorado, we have a standardized state-led process for that. And for a lot of our rationales, that really played into it. And I think for us too, certainly I know that not lots of people go in and read our in-depth site visit reports, but I do think that they mattered a lot for schools. And Ryan's lever of the term length is the most important one, but what goes in the site visit reports also mattered and allowed us to have some nuance. There's some schools that got 2-year renewals in this most recent cycle for us that we said we actually do see a strong trajectory of improvement, but based on historic performance, we want to have that comprehensive check-in more closely.
Okay. Well, let me play devil's advocate, and I think there's sort of two criticisms that the historical charter authorizing community would have. Number one, like, are you micromanaging? Are you getting in the business of the charter schools and taking away their autonomy? And number two is sort of the carrot farmer. Are you pulling the carrots up, every week to see how much they've grown and actually getting in the way of growth because you're in their business so much measuring, and the burden on the school doing the renewal, the burden on authorizer is too high, and it's way too much work, and the carrots will never thrive. So let's talk about autonomy first. Do you feel like you're infringing on autonomy, Matt, or how do you feel about their ability to pick their work, during that interim period?
I think it's a really important question. In terms of how we are writing our performance contracts, they're all outcomes based unless there's a history of compliance concerns in the contract. That's a pretty small number of schools, and it's things that there would not be a lot of discussion around in terms of special education or things like that. We are never dictating a school what they need to do to improve, just trying to set a clear benchmark for what that improvement should look like. And, for us now, that's aligning also to our state system. So it's one of the reasons that we stick to our performance goals for being the overall performance rating in almost all cases. Certainly with the pandemic, we've had to adjust that on some short-term basis.
How about you, Ryan? Well, I guess I would add to Ryan.
Yeah,
as you respond. One other piece too, as you respond. I know that CSI has done a lot of work to support its schools. So you're both looking at them more often, having the direction to them, and you're playing a more supporting role in their improvement. So how does that work in order to honor autonomy and keep them as happy partners?
Yeah, no, I mean, so I think like Matt said, our work tends to continue to focus on ways in which schools can be supported in achieving the outcomes in whatever way they want to get there. So we've done a lot of work, as you mentioned, right, around our continuous improvement supports and grown kind of how we've supported schools in developing the unified improvement plan, those major improvement strategies that Matt mentioned. We're not dictating what those improvement strategies should be. We're not dictating how schools should achieve those outcomes. Rather, we're simply helping them to think through methodologies around continuous improvement, improvement planning, providing thought partnership there that allows them to be a little bit more, to leverage some of the best practices in that space and get the most bang out of their buck, so to speak there. So that's how we operate, with renewal. We do ask them to submit their improvement plan as a part of renewal. We use that as a part of our renewal site visit. So we create expectations around their improvement strategies and how those are observable in the site visit. The schools co-create those observables with us. So in both of those instances, right, we're still maintaining the school's autonomy to create whatever improvement strategy they want, articulate whatever outcomes we'll be able to observe in those visits. And we're just looking to observe whether or not they're doing that, and whether or not we can observe what they say we're going to observe. So I think we do, as Matt said, we keep this close to mind whenever we're making revisions, and we want to make sure that all of our action continues to preserve school autonomy.
Then how about the small carrot problem? Is this too much work? Is this a burden on you and the school, or is this reasonable stuff that's easy to measure? How do you feel about the extra workload that happens by dealing with more schools in your portfolio more often for something as intense as a renewal question? Want to go first, Ryan?
Yeah, no, this is a great question and one that we're grappling with. So as part of our standard practice, after every renewal cycle, we debrief and we reflect on how things went. And we're having these conversations right now, trying to adjust and pivot. And that is a question we're considering. And we're looking at it from an equity lens as well, right? Some of our schools that receive the shortest contracts are serving students that the majority of whom are the furthest from educational justice in our system. And we're asking schools to do more work on top of serving these students who need more from the schools generally. So it is a question that we're grappling with from an equity concern, from a staff capacity concern, from a relationship concern. Are there other ways for us to address those challenges that may be present in a school that manifest in a 2-year renewal outside of a 2-year renewal? We don't have an answer to that question right now, but I think we're trying to figure out if there are lighter touch ways for us to do that. We've already simplified and streamlined our renewal process just about as far as we can go. We can't really spin off any more pieces. So it really is, a question of the process itself and those conversations themselves. And that's still an open question, but one I think that authorizers need to ask.
Yeah. How about you, Matt? You got 58 schools in the portfolio, and you always got more renewals coming up next year. Do you ever get a sinking feeling that, oh no, I just added 4 more to 2 years from now?
It is something that we think about both from an internal capacity and an external capacity, and I'll speak to both. I do know Ryan wanted to note that Ryan quickly hopped over having an efficient process, which I know he and his team spent a lot of time on, but I think is something that's really important. My old manager used to always talk about that I should never add a question to our charter renewal application unless I was removing another one, just to be consistently mindful of what we're asking. And our charter renewal application, I think, sits at 12 pages right now, because we like to think about really the proof is in the pudding in terms of their historic performance in the site visit. That being said, it is still a very stressful and can be a very burdensome process, and we know that. I think a couple of things that we think about, we do have an advantage as a district authorizer, although we have 58 schools, none of them sit more than a 45-minute drive away from this office. And folks from my team and from our building, a lot of our support folks are in schools all the time. Many of them, I believe 85% of our charter students attend school in a DPS owned facility. So we try to leverage those supports to still be supports. We don't want that to turn to accountability, but to know how schools are going. And that makes us feel more comfortable that if something unexpected were to happen at a school, we have other leading indicators besides renewal that we can lean into without making a school go through a renewal process. Another aspect I like to think about for this is just leveraging our compliance escalations. Again, knowing that we have tools outside of renewal to address a concern. If we have a particular compliance concern with an issue, renewal is not necessarily the best way to approach it. And certainly there's possible revocation. We very rarely have ever gotten there, but like to leverage that as a tool. And the last thing I think about in terms of our internal capacity is just, and this is a conversation we've had with some of our more charter skeptical stakeholders, is that I think those 5-year renewal terms are really important if you are someone who is not as trusting of charter school, because we only have so much staff capacity, and it really opens up our capacity to differentiate and focus on schools who we do need to more closely watch versus going through a really timely process with schools that all indicators are serving kids well.
Yeah, what I think about it also as from the family perspective, that more predictability leads to less stress, and people can understand the risk that's there when a school that's really struggling, and parents should rightfully know that. And at the same time, they don't need to be overly concerned that a school that you never intend to close might be about to close. So it's really helpful to have all the communication and to de-escalate the stress when the stress doesn't need to be there. I also think about this, going back to my role as a board member. How do you communicate with your boards, educate them about what you're doing, hear from them about what they need? Tell us a little bit, Ryan, you want to go first in terms of CSI strategies for engaging your board?
Yeah, we are, I mean, first and foremost, very lucky to have, 100% charter supportive board, which makes us a little unique here in the political ecosystem today. The CSI board is made up of 9 members, 7 of whom are appointed by the governor, 2 of whom are appointed by the commissioner. We have to have a political balance in terms of political affiliation. There are other requirements that have to be met to be a CSI board member. So a lot of our engagement with the board is really around making sure they kind of understand the ways in which CSI evaluates schools differently and how we differentiate, school quality from that of the state or that of other authorizers. So a lot of our time is spent, walking them through our CSI annual review of schools process, talking about the things that we think are important in terms of charter school viability and sustainability. So there is that kind of education piece. We have a committee, our performance management committee of the board that does a deeper dive into the substantive matters here with renewal ahead of the board conversation. So we kind of leverage them and their roles as committee members. We also work to create opportunities for the board to be more familiar with all of our schools, but also in particular the renewal schools. So one of the parts of our process that sort of kicks off the board engagement phase of our renewal process is a presentation to the board. So each renewal school gets about 20 minutes in a full board meeting to present to the school or to the CSI board, what makes them unique, what makes them special, what their improvement strategies are, what their strategic plan is. We invite the board chair, the school board chair to participate, the school leader to participate, and it really sets that context. In addition to that, we do a lot of school visits. And we invite board members to be part of our renewal visits or just other school visits. Our board has to travel regionally as a part of their work. And so every October we're in Colorado Springs. So we try to pair that with tours of our Colorado Springs schools when we're down there. Every September, we tend to go out to the Western Slope. So when we're out there, we try to pair that with school visits as well, just trying to make sure that because we have such a widespread, far-flung portfolio, that at every opportunity we give board members a chance to see the schools in person. And again, then we use that context to talk about how schools are performing and how that context may impact their improvement or their outcomes. So there's a lot to it. Some of it, a good bit of it happens during the renewal cycle, but a good bit of it also happens outside of the cycle, just making sure boards are aware of the wide range of schools we have across the portfolio.
And how about at DPS, Matt? What are your strategies to educate and engage and work with your board?
A number of things, and certainly I've said there's a lot of reasons why I like being a district authorizer. This is one that is certainly a challenge because our board has a lot of things besides our work to be focused on, especially in the last 2 years. But to highlight some key strategies, we've tried to start using our system of board regulations, which are updated by staff, to really codify all of our authorizing practices. So new school authorizing, charter renewal, our work with innovation schools, to really make sure that there is a clear, very public, transparent framework in place before we start any cycle, and to communicate with our board that if they are going to make some sort of policy level change that would impact our work, the timeline on which our work starts, so that they could be strategic about when to have that input. Some other things we've done based on some recommendations, I believe from CASB, we offer in election years to meet with board members, anyone who's registered as a candidate at a certain point, about upcoming authorizing decisions. So they're getting up to speed before they're on. A lot of our real high stakes decisions often come within a board member's first or second meeting, which can be very challenging, and have found that to be helpful. We have been asked often to provide presentations on our frameworks, again, on the framework level before it's about the actual recommendations. I think we had 2 or 3 meetings with our board this fall in the open public setting. We'll often do 2x2s with our legal team to provide more legal counsel and guidance and to allow them to have more of an open Q&A with counsel. In terms of 2 areas we're thinking about going forward is a district authorizer, how can we just provide more updates on charter schools as a part of all of our updates on schools? And here in DPS, like with that family of schools approach, has been the case in many times. Like when we're looking at state performance data, charter schools are in there along with everyone else, but we're trying to find more ways to make it more clear of how schools are doing just through all the updates our board is getting. And our board has also looked for us for some guidance, and they talked about this in our public meeting most recently of what is their proper role in engaging with schools, both at renewal and not in renewal, as board members to understand the school's unique mission, vision, and who they serve.
Thanks for the details. I think when I'm talking to other district staff around the state, they're often trying to figure out how to do this, but they do it less often than they have smaller portfolios. And so it just comes up. They may not have a renewal for once every 5 years if they've only got 1 or 2 in their portfolio, and so the history isn't there. Although the relationships may be there because there's fewer schools in the whole system. But let's think about that for a little bit. Let's shift to our colleagues in CACSA around the state. What kind of lessons do you think we would share? Let's think about maybe break it up a little bit into what can a bigger authorizer with 10 schools, 5 schools in the portfolio do, and what can one that only has 1 school do to take away some of your lessons. What do you think, Matt? Speaking from the biggest, what would you tell a smaller district to do based on your experience?
I think one thing we have to do for our scale is just think of ways to be consistent. I manage our charter renewal process, but with 17 schools in renewal, I only personally go on half of those visits. And so having some sort of consistent framework that can be applied that, obviously is in line with statute and policy, but to make sure that your decision-making is applied to the same to each school with room for professional judgment. And certainly that's important for us because of scale within a batch, but I could also imagine that for a small authorizer, that's important if you're only having periodic decisions because you're just not getting to do it as often.
How about you, Ryan? What would you do if you only had a handful of schools or 1?
Yeah, and I think what Matt said really resonates. But I think on top of that, it's the creating the systems and structures for ongoing communication, to and from schools and with the board. Again, when we had the pivot in 2020 due to COVID, I think one of the successes of that was the fact that we were really in collaboration with our school leaders, our school boards, the CSI board, discussing kind of what this means, what the implications are. And I think that really built off of work we had done previous to that to build closer relationships with schools, so that we're not, an us versus them. It's not we're out to get you or any of that, but that we're all operating from the same place. I've been in your school for renewal visits, but I've also been in your school for other reasons. So I think, it's just trying to find ways to keep those doors open, keep those conversations happening across, all of those different stakeholder groups, I think is critical.
Great. And Matt, you talked to a good point about, so often this is a January agenda item and people take new roles on boards from the elected boards in January. What are the strategies for bringing people on board and also for engaging the board in determining what the policy and the direction is? Like, can you talk a little bit about your codification of, your approach and how that allows you to move forward?
Yeah, I think really one of the things I most appreciated in our current cycle in terms of getting new board members up to speed was the role of our more experienced board members. And in a lot of those conversations, it was board members who had been in those conversations last spring who were helping share the rationale and context from an elected official, which is not a perspective that I or anyone in my office can share, which I found really, really helpful. And certainly even our new board members also step into that role with a lot of context and experience. So that's really a great asset too. For us, it's been a little bit shifting because our board adopted a policy governance framework in October. So what it's looked like in the past has been that we let the board know when they can make not when they can make, but when we would advise them to make certain policy decisions. And then we would build our regulation after that. What it's now looking like is the board really digging into any sorts of ends policies or executive limitations, knowing that staff is going to operate within that using their discretion. So helping them, know the legal framework, know some of our CACSA best practices, state best practices, things like that, is they consider why would something, should they consider something as an executive limitation or not. And then really thinking about then that regulation piece is being super important of in both of those frameworks, this is what we're going to do. And everyone, our charter schools, our board members, community members know what we're going to do before we execute on it. And then there's no surprises when recommendations come.
How about at CSI? What's your approach to the sort of evolution and codification of the approach, especially in these last 2 years when so much has been changing? Ryan?
Yeah, and I think we're trying to continue to refine those processes because we find that the better we are able to codify our prior processes, the better able we are to kind of implement consistent processes moving forward, with new board members, or, heaven forbid, I win the lottery and, go somewhere else. Someone can take these processes and kind of arrive at the same conclusion that I have. I think Matt has mentioned professional judgment several times. And I think the goal, right, is to create a system where the professionals are able to exercise professional judgment, but that the judgment won't substantively differ, if Matt and I were to switch places, that we would sort of arrive at the same conclusions given our professional expertise. So trying to create systems around how we do that, that's manifested its way, in a couple of different ways with CSI. We've started to create what we call our guide to renewal action by school performance, which starts to outline, what it means to be a 5-year renewal school versus a 3-year renewal school, like Matt described as a DPS board policy. That's organically evolved over time. And I think we also try to look at prior decisions and try to lift those up when we're talking through current decisions. So like in prior years, this school got a 2-year renewal. How does that school look different from or similar to a school this year that's getting a 2-year renewal? So in some instances, we leverage the historical experience of our board members who lived through those decisions. And in other cases, it's staff sort of lifting up that institutional memory. So trying to make sure that that context is available. I think those are the 2 things I would mention.
Okay. Well, I think this will be very useful to other your peers around the state. I really appreciate your taking the time to debrief with us this process. Before we sign off, are there any last words of advice for other people in the field? Can we go first, Ryan?
No, I don't think there's anything additional that I would offer. We just, I guess, other than, the context continues to evolve and change. Schools and school leaders continue to have to adapt daily. So just continue to encourage authorizers and myself to ground us in what is going on in schools. Visit schools, as appropriate as you're able, to continue to make sure you're kind of seeing the world through a school leader's eyes, because what we do has impact on them and the students they serve. We can pare down our renewal process, as to make it as light of a lift as we can, but there's still the anxiety around a school leader going through renewal, knowing that they might not be renewed, or there may be things that come up. So we can't really ever address that other than to continue to ground ourselves in kind of their experience and make sure we're putting students and communities first as we make these decisions and adjust our processes.
Thanks, Ryan. How about you, Matt? Any last words?
I think anything that we did in the last 2 years that we've been really proud of as a team has been the result of something that got feedback from our school leaders, from board members, from other folks who don't do authorizing in the district, from our peer authorizers, from the 2 of you. So would really just emphasize that, is we go into year 3 of the pandemic and try and think about what will probably be the trickiest year for authorizing, given some of the traditional data sources, to make sure you're talking to lots of different stakeholders to get feedback on whatever you're doing, because it's going to make it better.
That's great. Wise words for everybody. Well, I think that closes our podcast. So thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Matt. I know you've got a lot to do, and I really appreciate your taking the time to share with your colleagues. So tune in to the next CACSA podcast, coming to you on similar topics where your peers will share with you their advice and strategies. But thanks, everybody, and we'll close it off from there.